Okay, so this is experiments with book reviewing on video part 1. This is probably going to be a bit of a disaster. First time I've done this in the video format. I'm not comfortable with it yet. I'm probably just going to be rambling on and on, but I'm going to give this a try for, I don't know, for a while at least, and see if I can become more comfortable with it. As luck would have it, actually, the book I'm reviewing today is one that's for professional development. It's the Lexical Approach by Michael Lewis. It's not of general interest to anybody else except English teachers, English as a second language teacher. So sorry about that. That's just how the schedule happened to fall when I decided I was going to start up this project. But yeah, anyone who's not teaching English, this is not going to be of interest. So I started this book like a year and a half ago. I think I started it like maybe in March 2015, and I think I finished it April 2015 or May 2015, around then. And I'm just getting the review up now, which is a bit embarrassing. But like, there was a lot of stuff in this book, and I felt like I wanted to give my 2 cents on everything he touched on, and it just meant that the review became unmanageable. There was so much stuff to say that I didn't even know where to begin, and I just got frustrated, and then I gave up. And I'm just kind of getting around to it now. So the book is called The Lexical Approach. Lexis, kind of in ELT terminology, meaning like it's similar to vocabulary, but it's not just vocabulary. It can also be kind of phrases like "would you like," or "it's raining cats and dogs," or something like that, that just kind of act as a coherent whole. But then within the book, he doesn't confine himself to that. He kind of talks about anything and everything. He spends a lot of time kind of talking about the nature of language, how we don't really understand grammar rules, how to a large extent grammar rules cannot be understood. He spends a lot of time setting this up. In fact, I made margin notes as I went through this. And at a certain point, where was it? On page 69, I wrote to myself, wow, he is really getting abstract. When will this book get practical? At that point, he was talking about literature and art, science and mathematics, chaos theory, and how he thought that maybe they should relate to our view of linguistics. So if you're picking up this book as like an English teacher looking for practical ideas, you don't get a lot of that, especially like in the first 100 pages. Then it does start to get more practical to a certain extent. He talks about what needs to be emphasized more in English classes, but he doesn't really give a lot of ideas for implementing how to do it, which is something I struggled with while I was trying to use some of these ideas in my own classroom. Now, to be fair, he has a whole separate book implementing the lexical approach, which presumably is going to talk about practical ideas of how to implement that. I've not read that book, so I can't comment on that. All I can say for this book is there's a lot of interesting ideas, but I was kind of left a little floundering as to how exactly to implement them in the classroom. Then, the last part of the book, he gets into talking about basically how everyone's teaching wrong, or the current methodologies are all wrong. He criticizes a lot of what's currently taught on the CELTA courses and I think other popular TEFL courses. For example, he doesn't like the PPP approach, which is kind of one of the main CELTA approach, where you present the grammar point, practice it, and then produce it. He thinks instead I think observe, hypothesize, experiment is the paradigm he wants to replace it with, where students kind of observe the language, they make their own natural hypothesis, and they experiment with it. It's not as teacher-centered as PPP, and I think it's kind of happening on the learner's time scale. Another thing is he doesn't like error correction. Even delayed error correction, which is what was currently taught in the CELTA, he's not a fan of that. And I can understand that to a certain extent. I suppose it depends what the nature of the error is. For example, if the learner is making the error unconsciously, like as part of their interlanguage system at that point, then maybe explicit conscious correction is not going to fix that. But to put this in Krashen's terms, maybe if the learner is using their monitor to edit the language and they're making the error because because the monitor has the wrong ideas about the grammar rule, then maybe correction would be useful. Well, the other thing I thought as well, he doesn't, I think sorry, I'm getting my thoughts together. He doesn't talk at all about fossilization in this book. And obviously the advantage of correcting is to prevent fossilization from happening. Now, I think he's under the impression that fossilization doesn't exist because he doesn't talk about it at all in the book. But that's debatable. Maybe it does exist, and maybe if you correct early enough on, you can prevent fossilization. Also, in my own just kind of anecdotal experience, pronunciation mistakes are an issue. And those, I think, again, just anecdotally, in my classes, they seem to fossilize very quickly. I'm not sure, I don't remember him making a distinction between kind of grammatical or lexical mistakes and pronunciation mistakes. But I think there's a case to be made for being very aggressively correcting pronunciation mistakes. Maybe even correcting them on the spot. And even though, like, I know CELTA, they teach delayed correction. But like, I wonder maybe if you correct them on the spot, you could prevent fossilization of pronunciation mistakes happening. It seems to be something I've noticed in my class when I do on-the-spot correction of pronunciation mistakes, even during fluency activities. I think that does help with the pronunciation. The students do seem to get better pronunciation. Yeah, what else doesn't he like about the CELTA? CELTA and a lot of kind of other courses will teach teachers to minimize teacher talking time. He doesn't approve of that. I think he's on the same page with Krashen with that, where he thinks the teacher can be a valuable source of input. Now he says, of course, like, there is some unproductive teacher talking time. And maybe we should distinguish between good teacher talking time and bad teacher talking time. But a lot of courses like the CELTA don't do that. They just teach minimize teacher talking time as like an absolute. And he says in this book, he says, I've run into teachers kind of fresh off these courses who believe that at all costs they should avoid teacher talking time. And he said that's just absurd. Students can benefit from listening to the teacher talk. And I think I'd agree with that, actually. So, yeah, he goes off on all sorts of tangents, but the main point, to return to what I started to say earlier, is talking about the lexical approach, emphasizing vocabulary and emphasizing lexis, like words and phrases, that students should memorize or should be taught, as opposed to kind of focusing on grammar. There's a couple reasons he's in favor of this. One is he is of the position that grammar rules don't really exist as the textbooks will commonly present them. The textbooks will kind of oversimplify them. I think the examples he uses are the differences between will and going to, which textbooks, they say you use will in this case, you use going to in this case, but actually a lot of these rules are fairly artificial. He talks about direct speech, which is something I completely agree with him on, when he says like the way textbooks teach direct speech doesn't reflect the way it is often used in real life. And he talks about conditionals. He says the way the first, second, and third conditional are taught reflects maybe one way that these ideas could be expressed, but by making them too prescriptive, you're really kind of presenting an inaccurate view of language to the students. And he says in the book, like our ideas of how grammar works is actually like even the linguists right now don't have a full idea of the grammar of spoken language. They make kind of very provisional guesses. And for the ELT textbooks, the English language textbooks, to just turn these into prescriptions for the students, he's not in favor of that. Or at least he thinks that shouldn't be the emphasis. That's one of the problems with emphasizing grammar. Instead, he wants to emphasize lexis and vocabulary. I think he makes a very good point. Not all of this is his own ideas. He's quoting a lot from Whittleson and from Krashen. But he makes the point that, like when communication breaks down, it's not because the students didn't correctly change the verb in reported speech, or it's not because they didn't use the past tense in the conditional. Communication will break down because of vocabulary issues, where there's an unknown vocabulary that the students don't understand, or where they can't convey their message because they don't have the appropriate vocabulary. That's been true in my experience, both as a language teacher and as a language learner. Almost all of the instances I can think of where communication broke down in the classroom, or like in real life, was almost always because of vocabulary issue. So he says, vocabulary is what makes up the language. So why do we spend all this time teaching grammar? We should emphasize the vocabulary first and foremost, and then once they learn the vocabulary, they can infer the grammar rules often just because they know the vocabulary. But he says like the reverse doesn't work. If you know the grammar, you can't infer unknown vocabulary just because you know the grammar structure. And that made a lot of sense to me while I was reading it. It especially made a lot of sense to me because at the time I started this a year and a half ago, I had been teaching a grammar-based curriculum where I had to teach conditionals and reported speech to teenagers, and they were expected to perform it perfectly on a test. They had to transform these sentences from direct speech into reported speech, and it had to be perfect or they lost the point. And almost none of them could get it perfect. So after one term, I thought, well, okay, it's my fault I didn't drill it enough. So I started drilling reported speech a lot more, doing a lot more worksheets on it, and they still couldn't get it. And I think in retrospect, they just weren't ready for that. Maybe the order of acquisition and all that. But I also, it was also making a lot of sense what he was saying in this book, because all that time we spent on reported speech and getting, the transformation exactly right did not add to their communicative ability at all. Whereas if we had spent that time increasing the vocabulary, maybe that would have added a lot to their communicative ability. So that experience made me very sympathetic to what he was saying in the book, and I thought, yes, absolutely. We should concentrate on increasing the students' vocabulary size and not worry so much about grammar. And so I've been experimenting with different ways of doing that over the past year and a half. Like I said, it's taken me forever to get this review together. And during that time, I've had some time to experiment. I found that it's not quite so easy in practice. I mean, it sounds very simple, like increase a student's vocabulary. But actually, like getting that vocabulary word off of the paper and into the student's brain is actually not quite, I mean, that's where all the difficulty lies. And I think he glosses over that difficulty here. Although, to be fair, again, there are other books on this, which maybe have some better ideas. But I found it very difficult to get the vocabulary into the student's long-term memory for a number of reasons. One was just like the students weren't motivated to study these vocabulary lists at home. And there was kind of maybe a limited amount of time to do in the classroom. And that's, I don't know, is that a fair criticism? I mean, it has to do with student motivation. In an ideal world, students would be perfectly motivated and it wouldn't be an issue, but it seemed to be an issue in my classroom. Also, it's a lot more difficult to learn a word than you would think initially. Like getting the pronunciation of the word right, that in itself can be quite a struggle for just kind of one word. If you have like a whole vocabulary list of 10 words that you're trying to get them to learn a week or whatever. Now, some words are more difficult than others, and again, to be fair, he does talk at length about this in the book. There are some words that have a very strong one-to-one correspondence, like, basically anything that can be put on a picture. So like a dog. You can show a picture of a dog, everyone knows it's a dog. I think in the book he uses the example of ladder. I mean, ladder has many idiomatic meanings in English, which he says in the book. But you can also draw a picture of a ladder, and everyone knows exactly what that is, and then you attach a word to that picture, and that's like that's a one-to-one correspondence. But I think once you move away from nouns and maybe certain action verbs, I mean like swimming, running, singing, then it's very hard to kind of match words up to pictures, to match the words up to pictures, and then getting the nuance of this word is extremely difficult. How to get that across to the students. It requires more than just a dictionary definition. And in the beginning I was just trying to give them dictionary definitions and hoping they would learn the word, and they didn't. They didn't fully understand the meaning or how it was used or the connotations or the collocations. Again, he does talk about all this in the book. Connotations, collocations, the importance of context in determining meaning. But if there were practical implications for how to approach this in the classroom, then I missed it. It was a frustration I encountered. Now that's just for one word. He's in favor of teaching kind of longer phrases. But for longer phrases, it just gets that much more difficult. Like for me, for native speakers, these phrases will just roll off the tongue, as far as I know. But if you're teaching this to someone as a non-native speaker, then they have a very hard time remembering it. Almost each syllable has to be remembered separately, and for these long phrases, it's very hard to get it perfectly into their long-term memory. They tend to get, like, in my classes, they often got some sort of mangled version of these words into their head, of these phrases into their head. They would mispronounce words, they would drop a lot of words, they would change the order of the words. Which is a problem. I mean, he says in the book that errors are to be expected along the way, but he also makes a case. He believes that part of the way we learn our first language is not kind of universal grammar like Chomsky would think of it. He thinks that we don't absorb words or grammar, we absorb kind of chunks, like what do you want? And then these chunks are kind of broken down and processed later after we've memorized them, and then we kind of get our grammar out of these chunks. So instead of using our grammar to form phrases, we absorb the phrases as kind of like a ready-made lexical unit, and then we analyze the phrases and we can get our grammar from that. So, like, if that's what he's advocating, then if a student kind of misremembers a phrase, then that's not going to be helpful for them to kind of analyze to get their grammar from it. And I found it very difficult to get the students to remember these phrases perfectly without the phrases getting kind of mangled in their heads. Yeah. So I found in practice it wasn't quite as easy as it was in theory, although the idea appealed to me in theory. That reminds me though, speaking of his idea of phrases, I think everything he writes is quite debatable, but the idea that he advocates the idea that we don't really make sentences from the bottom up. Instead, we have a stock of ready-made phrases in our head, and we kind of pull these up. Of course, we do sometimes produce completely novel utterances, so for that we do need a grammar system. He advocates in this book, and again he's quoting from some other writers, that we actually have two systems. We have a grammar-based system, and we also have kind of a stored lexicon of phrases. And both systems are necessary, because you need the grammar-based system because sometimes you want to say something completely new. But in real-time production, of course, processing time is a factor, and if you can pull these ready-made lexical phrases out of your brain without spending time processing and putting them together, then that helps in real-time production. So he says that's why evolution, he doesn't use the word evolution, but I think that's what he's inferring. That's why evolution has given us these two separate systems. Which is, well, I don't know, it's hard to argue against, because he's arguing that we have both. So if you say, no, we can't possibly rely on a storage base of lexical phrases because grammar is important, then he could say, no, we've got the grammar system as well. So, like, I think it's hard to disprove. Maybe it might even be right. It's different than some of the other books on linguistics I've read, particularly The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, which he spends a significant amount of time in that book advocating against the idea that language is made up of nothing more than stored phrases. He advocates for a more grammar-based system. But again, I guess it doesn't necessarily contradict Michael Lewis, because Michael Lewis would say, no, we have both systems. Although Michael Lewis puts much more emphasis on the stored lexical phrases system, and he seems to think that that's much more useful. So I don't know. I'm not. This is kind of above my level of expertise. I'd be interested how someone like Steven Pinker would respond to this book. Or for that matter, I guess I'd be interested to see how Michael Lewis would respond to Steven Pinker. Yeah, another thing about this book, as long as I'm comparing it to other writers, Michael Lewis is a big fan of Krashen. He likes comprehensible input. And he doesn't think that the lexical approach is necessarily a contradiction to comprehensible input. And he quotes Swan here. Apparently Swan was the one who wrote it first. But Michael Lewis, quoting Swan, says, when you look at what Krashen has written about the limitations of conscious study, Krashen seems to be primarily concerned with grammatical systems. You can't, in Krashen's view, you can't acquire grammar by consciously studying it. But Michael Lewis and I guess Swan also, they feel that Krashen has not written a lot about vocabulary acquisition. So they argue that vocabulary acquisition maybe can be acquired consciously. So the way I kind of thought of it when I was reading this book is it's kind of like Krashen plus. Like you get to keep all your Krashen, but you just add on vocabulary study with that. Which sounded appealing to me because I like a lot of Krashen, so I thought, oh right, I get to keep all that and I just add vocabulary. And he advocates in some instances, decontextualized vocabulary lists. So again, it's not spelled out exactly how he envisions this, but I was thinking like the old idea of going through flashcards or lists. Again, some words are decontextualized easier than others. But the idea that you could do that, you could consciously study that, and then that wouldn't be in contrast to using a Krashen, to using Krashen system. Again, in practice, I found it difficult to get my students to remember decontextualized vocabulary. The idea was appealing, but I found myself wondering after a while if maybe Krashen's theory didn't need the addition. Maybe vocabulary was best learned just through the input. And Michael Lewis would like to make a shortcut and get extra vocabulary by extra vocabulary studying, but I'm wondering if you can make the shortcut. I found it very difficult to get this vocabulary into my students' head by just kind of drilling or explicit lists or something like that. And reflecting on my own studies as well, like when I was studying Japanese, for instance, there was a point when I was studying it at the university, when I was living in Japan, and we would have like lots of vocab that we would memorize every week, but like memorize it like off the list. And most of those words I just forgot, or if I remember them, they're buried in my brain somewhere. But the words that I would remember were words that after I had studied them off the list, I would hear them in real life, either just kind of around me. I was living in Japan at the time, or on TV. Like I was making it a point at the time to practice Japanese by watching a lot of Japanese TV shows. And I remember actually there was a couple times words we had studied in the list popped up on the TV show, and then it was like, oh right, these aren't just like words on a list. This is something I'm hearing in real life now that is useful for using in real life, and it stuck in my memory. I mean, like it was in my memory before, but it was in like a different part of my brain now. It was something I could like hear that vocabulary being repeated when I would think back at that movie, and I could, oh yeah, I remember that sentence, and I could kind of hear an echo of it in my brain, and then it was available for productive use when I was in conversation. Whereas before, like it wasn't available for productive use. It was just in a different part of my brain. I could never recall it in real time to use in a real-time conversation. So like I wonder if maybe the only use that studying a vocabulary list might have is to promote noticing a vocabulary when you encounter it in the input. But I'm not sure. My own experience learning and kind of teaching as well makes me a little bit maybe skeptical of the idea that you could teach this vocabulary and then have the students just have it be available for productive use in the students just from teaching it off from a list. I don't know. Perhaps I'm being a little bit unfair to what he's saying. He may not actually be advocating that. But that was another problem with this book, actually, is, I don't know, like it could be my problem. I should always preface every criticism I make by saying it could be my problem. Maybe I'm just a little